The Nexus Convention Center floated serenely in the void between three star systems, its crystalline spires catching the light of distant suns, like some cosmic chandelier designed by beings with far too much time and even more ego. Inside its pristine hall, representatives from across the galaxy had gathered for what the bureaucrats pompously called the annual Defense Innovation Summit, though everyone knew it was really just a fancy auction where the highest bidders got to play with the newest ways to obliterate their enemies. The Galactic Innovation Consortium had been running this particular circus for the better part of 3 centuries, and by now the whole affair had settled into a comfortable rhythm of predictable superiority. The same species showed up year after year, each convinced they held the key to revolutionary warfare, each desperately trying to impress the panel of judges who would ultimately decide which lucky inventor got to sign the most lucrative defense contract in known space. This year's crop of competitors was particularly entertaining if you enjoyed watching various forms of advanced life attempt to out-pretentious each other. In the northern wing of the convention center, the Heliax delegation had set up what could generously be called a mathematical light show. These crystalline beings, who looked like someone had taught geometry to grow legs and develop an attitude problem, spent their days contemplating the perfect angles of existence and their nights dreaming of force fields with absolutely no margin for error. Their representative, a towering prism of living quartz, practiced projecting holographic equations with the sort of religious fervor usually reserved for doomsday cults. Down the hall, the Vorth Collective had claimed an entire section for their demonstration space, though calling it their space was technically incorrect, since the Vorth had long ago abandoned individual consciousness in favor of a hive mind that made collective decisions through what they claimed was pure logical consensus. In reality, it was more like having a committee meeting that never ended, conducted by beings made of living energy, who could manipulate matter at the quantum level. They spent most of their time flickering between different states of existence, while debating the philosophical implications of their own weapons, which was either deeply profound or incredibly annoying, depending on your tolerance for metaphysical navel-gazing. The real show-offs, though, were the ancient ones from the outer spiral, who had been around so long they'd forgotten their actual species name and just went by titles that sounded vaguely important. These entities had witnessed the birth and death of entire civilizations, accumulated knowledge that spanned millions of years, and developed technology so advanced it was practically indistinguishable from magic. They communicated through direct mental projection, and had a tendency to treat every conversation like they were explaining basic concepts to particularly slow children, which was accurate but still irritating. And then there was the human. She sat in the smallest booth in the convention center, surrounded by what could charitably be called equipment, and less charitably be described as a collection of devices that looked like they'd been assembled in someone's garage by a person with more enthusiasm than funding. Her demonstration area consisted of 3 folding tables, a portable holographic projector that had seen better decades, and what appeared to be a standard military-grade tablet that she kept tapping with the focused intensity of someone playing a particularly challenging puzzle game. The other species hadn't bothered learning her name, though the registration files listed her as a representative of the Terran Defense Consortium, an organization that most of the galaxy considered to be somewhere between quaint curiosity and elaborate practical joke. Humans, after all, were the newcomers to galactic civilization, having only achieved faster-than-light travel within the last few centuries. They were loud, emotional, unpredictable, and had the disturbing habit of approaching complex problems with solutions that ranged from surprisingly effective to borderline insane. The Heliax representative had made a point of walking past the human's booth earlier, its crystalline form refracting light in patterns that somehow managed to convey disdain without actually forming words. The calculations were clear. Humans lacked the mathematical precision necessary for truly advanced warfare, their brains too chaotic, their thinking too non-linear. How could a species that still experienced random emotional fluctuations possibly compete against minds that operated with perfect geometric clarity? The Vorth Collective had reached a similar consensus through their usual process of quantum democratic deliberation. Their energy forms had briefly coalesced near the human's area, observing her primitive technology with the sort of polite interest one might show a child's crayon drawing. The human's equipment couldn't even manipulate matter at the molecular level, let alone bend reality to create weapons that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. It was almost endearing in the way that watching a pet attempt to perform complex tasks could be amusing. Even the ancient ones had spared a moment of their vast consciousness to contemplate the human presence, though their attention felt less like observation and more like a professor glancing at a student's homework before inevitably finding it wanting. They had seen species rise and fall, had witnessed the development of technologies that could reshape solar systems, and they found it mildly curious that the organizing committee had allowed such an obviously outclassed representative to participate. But the human seemed entirely unaware of the dismissive attention she was receiving. She continued working with her primitive equipment, occasionally making notes on what appeared to be actual paper, and substance so archaic that several species had to look it up in their historical databases to remember what it was called. When approached by convention staff, she was polite but focused, answering questions with the sort of calm confidence that suggested either remarkable self-assurance or complete delusion. The presentation schedule had been arranged in ascending order of expected impressiveness, which meant the human would be going last. This was partly a logistical decision. Let the obviously inferior demonstration close out the event, so everyone could leave on a high note from the real presentations, and partly an act of mercy, since following the advanced displays of her competitors would only make her primitive technology look more pathetic by comparison. As the day wore on and the various species made their final preparations, a subtle sense of anticipation filled the convention center. The Hiliacs ran final calculations on their geometric perfection, the Vorth harmonized their collective consciousness for maximum impact, and the ancient ones contemplated the vast implications of their million-year-old wisdom. Each group was confident that their presentation would secure the defense contract, and each group was equally certain that the human representative would provide a brief, amusing interlude before the real winner was announced. The human, meanwhile, finished whatever she had been working on and leaned back in her chair with the satisfied expression of someone who had just solved a particularly challenging puzzle. She glanced around at her competitors' elaborate preparations, smiled to herself, and made one final note on her paper tablet. "I'll present last," she had told the scheduling committee that morning, and something in her tone had made even the most dismissive aliens pause for just a moment. It wasn't arrogance, exactly, and it wasn't desperation. It was something else entirely, a quiet confidence that suggested she knew something the rest of them didn't. Of course that was impossible. What could a human possibly know that the greatest minds in the galaxy hadn't already discovered? The opening ceremonies would begin in an hour, and soon enough, everyone would find out exactly what the human thought she could accomplish with her primitive technology and charmingly naive optimism. It would be entertaining, certainly, and perhaps even educational in its own way. After all, there was always value in watching someone fail spectacularly, especially when they seemed so convinced they were about to succeed. The main presentation amphitheater had been designed by beings who clearly believed that if you were going to judge the future of galactic warfare, you might as well do it in style. Holographic projectors lined every surface. Gravitational field generators allowed for three-dimensional displays that could manifest in mid-air, and the seating arrangement put the judges on a raised platform that somehow managed to look both intimidating and pretentious simultaneously. The judging panel itself was a carefully selected collection of military strategists, defense contractors, and what the bureaucrats diplomatically called conflict resolution specialists, a term that sounded much nicer than professional war planner. They sat with the sort of composed attention that suggested they had seen every possible innovation in destructive technology, and were prepared to be mildly impressed at best. The Hiliacs representative took the stage first, its crystalline form refracting the ambient light into geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. When it spoke, its voice resonated with the sort of mathematical precision that made calculators weep with envy. "Esteemed judges," it began, each word carefully calculated for maximum acoustic impact, "we present the absolute defense matrix, a force field system based on perfect geometric harmonics that eliminates all possibility of structural failure." What followed was a display that would have made ancient Greek mathematicians abandon philosophy and take up worship instead. The Hiliacs projected a series of interlocking barriers that formed patterns so perfectly symmetrical they seemed to bend space around them. Each shield component locked into place with the satisfying precision of a universal constant, creating defensive structures that looked less like military equipment and more like the blueprints for reality itself. "Observe," the crystalline being continued, "how each angle reinforces the next, How every surface reflects force according to predetermined calculations. There is no chaos here, no unpredictability, no margin for error. Our defensive systems operate with mathematical certainty. The demonstration included a simulated bombardment that would have reduced most planets to component atoms, yet the geometric barriers absorbed each attack with the serene confidence of entities that had done the math and found it satisfactory. Energy blasts ricocheted in perfectly calculated trajectories. Kinetic weapons distributed their force across crystalline structures that converted destructive energy into harmless light patterns, and reality-warping attacks simply slid off surfaces that had been designed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The judges nodded with the sort of professional appreciation reserved for presentations that met expectations without exceeding them. Impressive, certainly, but the Heliacs had been perfecting geometric warfare for millennia. This was evolution, not revolution. The Vorth Collective took the stage next, though took the stage was perhaps inaccurate since they manifested as a shimmering cloud of energy that occasionally coalesced into recognizable form. When they spoke, their voice came from everywhere and nowhere, like listening to a committee meeting conducted by the fundamental forces of the universe. We present, they said in perfect unison, the quantum dominion system, warfare that operates beyond the constraints of singular reality. Their demonstration made the Heliacs display look quaint by comparison. The Vorth projected battlefield scenarios where their weapons existed in multiple probability states simultaneously, striking targets that hadn't yet decided where they wanted to be. They showed missiles that traveled backwards through time to destroy enemy installations before they were built, defensive systems that prevented attacks by convincing reality that the weapons had never been fired in the first place, and command structures that operated through pure quantum entanglement across galactic distances. Observe how we eliminate the inefficiency of linear cause and effect, the collective explained as their weapons phased through conventional defenses like light through transparent aluminum. Why fight an enemy when you can simply edit the probability that they exist in the same dimensional framework as your forces? The demonstration included what they modestly called a minor reality adjustment, in which an entire simulated fleet was convinced to attack itself through a process involving quantum psychology and aggressive probability manipulation. The enemy forces didn't just lose, they retroactively decided they had never wanted to win in the first place. Several judges made notes with the sort of careful attention that suggested they were either deeply impressed or completely lost. The Vorth's technology was undeniably advanced, though it came with the minor drawback of requiring operators who could think in 11 dimensions simultaneously, while maintaining collective consciousness across multiple probability states. The Ancient Ones approached their presentation with the casual confidence of entities who had been perfecting the art of warfare since before most species had evolved opposable thumbs. They didn't walk to the stage so much as reality gently rearranged itself to accommodate their presence, and when they spoke, their words carried the weight of geological ages. We offer the inevitability engine, they announced, their mental projection reaching directly into the consciousness of everyone present. Warfare based on the accumulated wisdom of 1,000,000 years of conflict. Their demonstration was less a show of force and more a masterclass in applied omniscience. The Ancient Ones had studied every form of conflict in galactic history, analyzed every strategic decision, catalogued every tactical innovation, and distilled the entire accumulated knowledge of warfare into systems that could predict and counter any possible military action before it was even conceived. They showed simulations where their forces defeated enemies by understanding their opponents better than they understood themselves, where battles were won through strategic maneuvers that had been planned centuries in advance, where entire wars concluded before they began because the Ancient Ones had already calculated every possible outcome and selected the path to victory. When you have witnessed the rise and fall of 10,000 civilizations, they explained with the patience of entities who had literally all the time in the universe, warfare becomes a matter of pattern recognition. Every conflict is a variation on themes we mastered when your species was still trying to figure out which end of a stick was more effective for hitting things. The demonstration concluded with a strategic scenario so complex it required 4-dimensional holographic projection, just to display the basic elements. The Ancient Ones' forces didn't just win. They achieved victory through methods so sophisticated that their enemies thanked them for the educational experience of being conquered by superior intellect. The judges sat in contemplative silence,
the sort of quiet that suggested they were trying to process displays of military technology that operated on levels beyond conventional understanding. Each presentation had been impressive in its own way, showcasing the pinnacle of their respective species' capability. Throughout all three demonstrations, the human had remained seated in the audience, taking notes on her primitive paper tablet with the focused attention of a student auditing an advanced course. She showed no signs of intimidation, no indication that she was reconsidering her decision to compete against technologies that could manipulate reality, time, and the fundamental concepts of existence itself. When the Ancient Ones concluded their presentation and the judges began their deliberation recess, she simply closed her notebook, stood up, and walked toward the preparation area with the sort of calm confidence that suggested she either had a master plan or had completely lost touch with reality. The other competitors watched her go with mixtures of curiosity and pity. What could she possibly have prepared that would compare to mathematical perfection, quantum omnipresence, or million-year strategic wisdom? In 30 minutes, everyone would find out exactly what the human thought she could accomplish with her folding tables and garage-assembled equipment. The anticipation was almost painful.
The human walked onto the stage with a sort of relaxed confidence that people usually reserved for activities they had practiced thousands of times, which was either remarkably reassuring or deeply concerning depending on your perspective. She carried her ancient tablet, a portable projector that looked like it had been designed by someone who had heard descriptions of advanced technology but had never actually seen any, and what appeared to be a thermos of coffee, a beverage that most of the galaxy considered to be a mild psychoactive stimulant, consumed by species too primitive to synthesize proper neurochemical enhancers. The judges leaned forward with the polite attention usually reserved for watching small children attempt to explain quantum mechanics. After witnessing demonstrations of mathematical perfection, reality manipulation, and million-year strategic wisdom, they were prepared to be charmed by whatever quaint display of human ingenuity was about to unfold. Distinguished panel, the human began, her voice carrying none of the reverent formality that had characterized the previous presentations. I'm here to introduce the Chaos Doctrine, a military philosophy based on the strategic application of controlled unpredictability. She activated her primitive projector, which flickered for a moment before displaying what could generously be called a schematic and less generously be described as a diagram, that looked like it had been drawn by someone having an argument with geometry. The display showed tactical formations that seemed to shift and change even as they watched, strategic plans that branched into dozens of contradictory possibilities, and command structures that appeared to have been designed by a committee of caffeinated anarchists. The fundamental premise, she continued, taking a sip of her coffee as if she were discussing the weather rather than military strategy, is that perfect systems are perfectly predictable, and predictable systems are perfectly vulnerable. The Heliax representative's crystalline form began refracting light in patterns that suggested profound confusion. Perfect mathematical systems were by definition superior to chaotic alternatives. How could randomness possibly compete against geometric certainty? The human seemed to notice the crystalline being's bewilderment and smiled. For example, your absolute defense matrix operates on the principle that every angle can be calculated, every force can be predicted, every attack can be geometrically countered. It's mathematically beautiful, which is precisely why it's strategically flawed. She manipulated her holographic display to show a simulation of the Heliax defensive system, recreating the geometric barriers with surprising accuracy given her primitive equipment. Then she introduced what she called adaptive chaos algorithms, attack patterns that deliberately avoided mathematical optimization, weapons that changed their approach mid-flight based on random variables, and assault strategies that made tactical decisions by consulting what appeared to be digital dice. Watch what happens, she said, launching her chaotic assault against the simulated geometric defenses. When your perfect mathematical calculations encounter systems designed to be imperfect. The results were fascinating in the way that traffic accidents are fascinating. You know you shouldn't watch, but you can't look away. The chaotic weapons didn't try to overcome the geometric barriers through superior force or more elegant mathematics. Instead, they did things that made no tactical sense. Missiles that deliberately missed their targets before circling back from unexpected angles, energy beams that flickered on and off apparently at random, assault forces that attacked according to patterns based on ancient human poetry. The geometric defenses designed to counter logical attacks through mathematical precision, found themselves trying to calculate optimal responses to tactics that had no logical basis. The crystalline barriers began flickering as their processing systems attempted to find mathematical solutions to problems that had been specifically designed to avoid mathematical resolution. Chaos, the human explained as her random weapons systematically dismantled the perfect defenses, is not the absence of strategy. It's strategy that refuses to be predictable. The Vorth collective began to coalesce into more solid forms, their energy patterns suggesting the sort of quantum agitation that occurred when hive minds encountered concepts they couldn't collectively process. Their simultaneous voice carried a note of what might have been uncertainty, though it was difficult to tell when dealing with beings who existed in multiple probability states. The human turned her attention to them next, recreating their quantum dominion system, with the same casual accuracy she had shown with the Heliax technology. Your weapons operate in multiple dimensions simultaneously, striking targets across probability matrices. Very impressive, except for one small problem. She introduced what she called quantum uncertainty amplifiers, devices that seemed to do nothing more complicated than generate random numbers very quickly. But when these simple randomness generators interacted with the Vorth's sophisticated probability weapons, something unexpected happened. The thing about quantum systems, she explained as her primitive random generators began causing the simulated probability weapons to malfunction in spectacular ways, is that they rely on being able to calculate possible outcomes. But what happens when you introduce variables that are genuinely random, rather than merely unpredictable? The quantum dominion weapons, designed to exist in multiple probability states simultaneously, found themselves trying to calculate outcomes for events that had no calculable probability. The quantum systems began experiencing what could only be described as existential confusion, trying to determine the likelihood of events that were occurring purely by chance rather than through any underlying quantum mechanical principle. Randomness, the human continued as the simulated Vorth weapons began attacking empty space and defending against threats that existed only in probability matrices that had been corrupted by genuine chaos. Is quantum mechanics' evil twin? It looks similar from a distance, but it plays by completely different rules. The Ancient Ones had been observing the proceedings with the sort of patient attention that entities who had witnessed the birth of galaxies could afford to maintain. But as the human began setting up her next demonstration, something in their vast consciousness shifted, a flicker of what might have been concern or perhaps recognition. And now, the human said, turning to address the Ancient Ones directly, we come to the inevitability engine powered by 1,000,000 years of accumulated strategic wisdom. Her recreation of their system was less detailed than the previous two, but she captured the essential elements, the vast databases of historical conflicts, the pattern recognition algorithms that could predict enemy actions before they were conceived, the strategic planning systems that operated on timescales measured in centuries. This is actually the most impressive of the three systems, she admitted, because it's based on the most fundamental truth of warfare, that intelligent beings will, given enough time and information, make optimal decisions. Your 1,000,000 years of experience have taught you to recognize every possible pattern of conflict. She paused to take another sip of coffee, and somehow that simple gesture made everyone in the amphitheater suddenly aware that they were about to witness something unprecedented. The problem, she continued, is that your system assumes your opponents are trying to make optimal decisions. But what happens when they're specifically trying to make terrible decisions for strategically sound reasons? What followed was a demonstration that made the previous two look like warm-up exercise. The humans' chaotic forces didn't just avoid optimal strategies, they actively sought out the worst possible tactical choices, and then implemented them with such systematic thoroughness that they became effective through sheer perverse persistence. Her simulated armies made decisions that violated every principle of military strategy the Ancient Ones had accumulated over their 1,000,000 years of experience. They attacked their own supply lines, retreated toward enemy strongholds, and divided their forces in ways that should have guaranteed defeat. But because these terrible decisions were made as part of a deliberate strategy of tactical chaos, they created situations that the Ancient Ones' pattern recognition systems couldn't process. When you've seen every possible pattern of intelligent warfare, the human explained as her chaotic forces achieved victory through methods so nonsensical that they transcended traditional concepts of military strategy, you become blind to the possibilities of deliberately unintelligent warfare. The Ancient One's vast consciousness focused on the human with an intensity that made the ambient temperature in the amphitheater drop several degrees. For the first time in geological ages, they had encountered something genuinely unexpected. The human noticed their attention and smiled. I've been studying all of you throughout this competition.
your psychology, your assumptions, your definitions of superiority, and I realized that you've all made the same fundamental error." She gestured to her primitive equipment, her garage-assembled projector, her paper note. "You assumed that because humans appear primitive, we must be inferior. But what if primitiveness isn't a limitation? What if it's a tactical advantage?" The judges sat in stunned silence as the implications of what they had just witnessed began to sink in. The human hadn't just demonstrated superior technology, she had shown that superiority itself might be a form of strategic vulnerability. "The chaos doctrine," she concluded, "isn't about having better weapons or more advanced technology. It's about being unpredictable in a galaxy that has become very, very good at predicting everything else." She powered down her projector and returned to her seat, leaving behind an audience of the galaxy's most advanced military minds trying to process the possibility that they had just been out-strategized by a species that still used paper for note-taking. The silence that followed was the sort of quiet that occurs when fundamental assumptions about reality require immediate and uncomfortable revision. The judges spent 17 minutes in deliberation, which was either remarkably quick for a decision involving the future of galactic warfare, or painfully slow for beings who had just watched their fundamental understanding of military strategy get dismantled by someone drinking coffee from a thermos. When they returned to their elevated platform, their expressions carried the sort of carefully controlled neutrality that suggested they were still processing what they had witnessed. The lead judge, a dignified entity whose species had been mediating galactic conflicts since before the invention of faster-than-light travel, cleared what might have been a throat. "After careful consideration of all 4 presentations, we have reached a unanimous decision." The Heliax representative straightened its crystalline form, internal calculations no doubt running probability matrices on its chances of success. The Vorth collective began to harmonize their energy patterns in preparation for either celebration or the quantum equivalent of sulking. The Ancient Ones maintained their eternal composure, though perhaps with slightly more effort than usual. The human continued sipping her coffee. "The Galactic Innovation Consortium defense contract," the judge announced, "is awarded to the Terran representative and her chaos doctrine." The silence that followed was so profound it seemed to have mass. Even the ambient hum of the space station's life support systems appeared to pause in recognition of what had just occurred. However, the judge continued, and something in their tone suggested they were about to explain reasoning that they themselves weren't entirely comfortable with. "We feel obligated to elaborate on the factors that influenced this decision." They activated a holographic display that showed statistical analyses, strategic projections, and what appeared to be several very complex psychological profiles. The Heliax Absolute Defense Matrix represents mathematical perfection in defensive technology. The Vorth Quantum Dominion System demonstrates reality manipulation capabilities that exceed our current understanding of physics. The Ancient One's Inevitability Engine draws upon strategic wisdom accumulated over geological timescale. The judge paused, and for a moment seemed to be struggling with concepts that didn't fit comfortably into traditional frameworks of military analysis. Each of these systems represents the pinnacle of their respective approaches to warfare. They are, by any conventional measure, superior to human technology in every quantifiable aspect. The human raised her hand with the casual gesture of someone asking a question in a particularly relaxed seminar. But, the judge agreed, "Conventional measures may be inadequate for evaluating unconventional approaches. Your demonstration suggested that advanced predictability might represent a form of strategic vulnerability that we had not previously considered." What followed was an explanation that would later be studied in military academies across the galaxy, assuming those academies could find instructors capable of teaching courses on the tactical applications of deliberate incompetence. The judges had realized, with the sort of uncomfortable clarity that comes from having one's assumptions systematically demolished, that the galaxy had spent millennia perfecting warfare against intelligent opponents who made optimal decisions. Every major military power in known space, the judge explained, has developed increasingly sophisticated methods for predicting and countering logical strategic choices. We have created systems so advanced that they can anticipate enemy actions before those enemies have conceived. The human nodded with the satisfied expression of someone whose point was finally being understood, which works perfectly as long as your enemies are trying to make logical strategic choices. Precisely. The judge's tone carried a note of what might have been admiration or possibly existential dread. Your chaos doctrine doesn't attempt to make optimal decisions. Instead, it weaponizes the act of making deliberately suboptimal decisions for strategically optimal reasons. The Heliac's representative's crystalline form began refracting light in patterns that suggested profound philosophical distress. How could imperfection be strategically superior to mathematical optimization? The very concept violated fundamental principles of logical analysis. The Voth collective experienced something that could only be described as a quantum identity crisis, as they attempted to reach consensus about strategies that were specifically designed to avoid consensus. Their energy patterns flickered between multiple probability states, none of which seemed to offer adequate frameworks for processing the concept of tactical random. The Ancient Ones remained silent, their vast consciousness turned inward, as they contemplated the possibility that their million years of accumulated strategic wisdom might have created a blind spot, precisely where they had expected to achieve perfect vision. Furthermore, the judge continued, the human representative demonstrated something that may be even more significant than her tactical innovation. Throughout this competition, she studied each of your approaches, analyzed your psychological assumptions, and developed countermeasures based not on superior technology, but on superior understanding of how advanced minds process strategic information. The human smiled and pulled out her paper notebook, flipping through pages covered with handwritten observations. The Heliacs think in perfect mathematical relationships, so they're vulnerable to problems that can't be solved through geometric optimism. The Voth make collective decisions through quantum consensus, so they struggle with scenarios that require individual initiative. The Ancient Ones rely on pattern recognition from historical data, so they're blind to genuinely novel approaches. She closed the notebook and looked around at her competitors with something that might have been sympathy. You're all incredibly advanced, which is exactly why you never considered the possibility that someone might achieve strategic superiority by embracing primitiveness as a tactical advantage. The contract signing ceremony that followed was perhaps the most awkward diplomatic event in galactic history. Representatives from the galaxy's most technologically advanced civilizations watched as a human equipped with folding tables and garage-assembled equipment officially became their primary military contractor. The Heliac's delegate approached afterward, its crystalline form still flickering with confused refractive patterns. Your technology is objectively inferior to ours in every measurable parameter. Absolutely, the human agreed cheerfully. That's what makes it so effective. The Voth collective manifested nearby, their energy forms pulsing with quantum uncertainty. We do not understand how deliberate inferiority can constitute strategic superiority. That's exactly why it works, she replied, packing her primitive equipment with the sort of casual efficiency that suggested she had been expecting this outcome all along. The Ancient Ones maintained their distance, but their mental projection carried a note of something that might have been respect. After a million years of believing they had seen everything, they had finally encountered something genuinely unprecedented. As the convention center began to empty and representatives from across the galaxy prepared to return to their respective civilizations, with news that would fundamentally challenge their understanding of military strategy, the human finished her coffee and made one final note in her paper notebook. The species that had seemed least capable of competing in a galaxy full of advanced civilizations had just proven that sometimes the most sophisticated strategy was to refuse to be sophisticated at all. They had weaponized their own apparent weaknesses, and turned the very concept of technological superiority into a tactical disadvantage. It was, the human reflected as she headed back to her ship, probably the most human solution possible, when faced with opponents who had perfected every possible approach to warfare, simply refused to play by the rules that made perfection possible. The galaxy would never see them coming, mostly because no one would think to look for threats that deliberately made themselves appear harmless.